Hey folks, welcome back to the Edupedia world, and I am Abhinay Gupta. And today again we will be continuing with the interpretation of statutes, deeds and documents. Right? So we have been continuing with this chapter for over 10 lectures so far, and we still have 2-3 lectures to go for this. And we were discussing basically about the internal aids to interpretation. Right, so all those who were with me throughout the classes, they are updated with it, and we have already covered around 5-6 different aids to interpretation, and there are still some more to go. Right, so in the immediate preceding lecture we were talking about the definitional section. That is where we ended the topic. Right, we discussed about the definitional section. So I'll just to bring out a link to the previous lecture, I'll again continue with, or I'll begin with a brief of the definitional section and continue with the illustration, proviso and rest. Right? It depends on how much the time permits for us to go ahead with. Right? And all those of you who are not with me throughout all the lectures, please go back, watch the other lectures and then come to this. And if anyone has a particular problem, a particular doubt with reference to the understanding of any particular aid that you're not able to understand, then for that you can refer to a particular video. But if you want to get through the entire chapter, right, go with the videos one by one, because that is the flow that even we have maintained. Right? So what did we see in the definitional clause, the definitional section? If you remember, generally we have the section 2 for the definitional section, but we refer to the example of section 5 of the Banking Regulation Act. Right, 1949, and we took up the example of the definition of banking. Right, so when we talk about the definitional section, we have these parameters to be judged. That is, definitional section is the key to proper interpretation, which always means that you do not refer to the dictionary meaning of the definition, but you refer to the meanings given in the definitional section, because that is the most appropriate meaning, and that is the meaning as per your legislature. Right, when they have prepared the statute, they have used that meaning, that specific meaning at the back of their mind to write about the statute. Right, so you cannot go ahead with the general meaning, the general acceptable meaning as per the definition, but when you are talking about any specific statute, any specific act, right, then you will have to construe it according to what is given in the definitional section. Right, so that is the key to proper interpretation of any specific word. Right, the second thing we saw that it shortens the language. And as I have always been telling you, why do you need to mug up the definitions? Why is it necessary for you to remember the definitions? Just because it helps you. In the examination, it fetches you good marks, right? It creates a good impression on the checker, and it helps you to write in précis. That means you can finish up your discussion on a particular point in 3-4 lines rather than extending it to 3-4 paragraphs, right? Because you do not get the words clear, and you go on writing your English, and you go on pretending to portray that you know everything, and then you portray the point, right? And to write each single point that may be consisting of 6-7 words, you add on 10-15 more words just to explain out the meaning. But understand, they are asking you a question. They just want, what is it? They don't want you to explain, yeah, you know why this is this. No. Unless and until asked, you don't have to go on with the explanation. Right? So it saves your time, it gives you a good presentation, it gives you a good impression. So it is always beneficial to learn the definition and use it in the examination. Right? It is similar to learning the sections to create an impression. Right? Then we have seen that the definitions are basically of two types, that is the exhaustive definition and the inclusive definition. Exhaustive definition means that there is nothing more than whatever is said. So whatever the statute has specified in the definitional section, that is it. You do not have to go beyond that. Right? And when we talk about the inclusive definition, then they go on to include a small part that, okay, whenever you're talking about this word, remember to include this. So that is the interpretation of the statute. The statute says we want this to be included in this definition, and rest the definition remains the same what it is applicable in the general parlance. right? That if you pick up the dictionary, if you pick up any other thing, and whatever definition you get over there, that is the definition that will be applicable, but in addition we'll have this. So it is an inclusive definition. An inclusive definition means you can also go beyond and include things that you think will fit the situation, right? And if we take an example, then in the exhaustive definition there are specific words that we use, right? So whenever your definition starts, for example, even the definition of banking, right, because we are constant with one example that we have taken, the word begins where they say banking means. So whenever they use the word means, right, just understand it is an exhaustive definition, that this is the only meaning. It means this and nothing beyond. That is means, right? So always remember that. If you use the word means or you use the word means and include, so okay, there is something else they're included, but what it means is specified and nothing beyond that. And when they're including something specifically, then only that specification will be included and nothing else, right? But otherwise, when they do not write means and include and they only write includes, right? As we took the example of transfer, so they say transfer includes blah 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 blah. That means it is an inclusive definition. This is what they have included in the definition of transfer, but transfer remains what it is in the general parlance, right? Or they can also use the word deemed to include or to apply and to include, right? These are the general words that are used in the definition that makes them an inclusive definition. So that is how you understand, right? That is how you interpret. Whenever you get a definition, you have to understand whether or not it is an inclusive definition or an exclusive definition. If it's an exclusive definition, do not add anything to it. But if it is an inclusive definition, you go on adding your words as per the situation, right? Best example, the banking, the definition of banking and the definition of transfer. Banking from the Banking Regulation Act and transfer from the Money Laundering Act, right? Remember these two examples as well, because these are the most simple example. Transfer, you have a one line definition, right? And if you otherwise go on to look, right, it becomes really difficult for you to search for inclusive definitions. If you flip your entire Banking Act, all the definitions are exhaustive definitions. So from there, banking is one definition that you will definitely learn for your banking chapter, right? Because that is the base. So that will solve the purpose over here. Just remember that, okay, when you are giving an example of the exhaustive definition, use the word banking, and when you are giving a definition of an inclusive task, then use the word transfer. And this was the question asked in your May 2016 attempt. Okay, so we move ahead with the next interpretation, the next aid to interpretation, that is illustrations, right? So I hope you all have come across illustrations since your class 11 or maybe before that, right? In your maths and other chapters, you all have seen what illustration means. So illustrations are basically some extensions, some inclusions by the statute, right, to explain the meaning, right, to make the meaning even more clear by the use of an example. So whenever the legislature, they frame the statute and they know that, okay, a statute that has been framed by the draftman, right, it is not very clear or it will be difficult to interpret it. So what they do is they append an illustration to that section. Now appending anything means adding it to the end, right? Use that word in the examination, append. Try learning more words to increase your or to improve your vocabulary as well, right? When you write such technical language, it adds on to an impression in your examination and obviously is a positivity, right? So illustrations are examples that are appended to a section, right? If we see what is there in the text, it is examples appended to section and they do not form part of the section. Okay, we'll come to that as well. So you must have seen illustrations, they actually contain examples, like they'll say Mr. X and Mr. Y did this and then the court decided to do this. So that is an illustration. They take an example, right, and they try to make it connected. They try to connect it to your real life. They'll take an example of two persons, they'll take an example of a situation, and then they will explain that, yeah, in these situation or with these person, how will this law or the statute react, right? How will it be used? So that is basically an illustration. So when you go with an illustration, when you understand an illustration, you understand, okay, this is the exact scope that they're talking about, right? This is the object of this section. So the object, scope and purpose is something that the illustration brings out, right? And when the legislature is actually preparing a statute, they have an intention behind, right? Maybe they have come across a problem, maybe they have come across a situation where while framing they themselves are not able to understand it very well, or when they are demonstrating it to some other people, right? Or the people who are drafting it, they are showing it to somebody else and they say no, it is not very clear. So what they do is at that point of time, they want their intention to be more clear, and then they decide, okay, let us include an illustration over here as to the usage of this statute, right? A hypothetical example that is very close to the real life is something that is included, and that forms part of the illustration, right? So basically it is also done when the language is so complicated that the user gets perplexed with it. Oh, what is this? How do I interpret it, right? You do not know what to do with that section, right? When things become really complicated, right, and interpretation is a task. So in that situation, illustration comes in as a rescue, right? At that point, the legislature adds an illustration so that it can explain the purpose of the section, right? And since it is appended to a section and it is just an explanation to the section, so it does not form part of that section. It is an added text to the section, but is not an integral part of the section. So whenever you go on to quote the section, or when you go on to describe the section, you do not describe an illustration for that, right? You do not always take that example. When you are quoting it somewhere, you don't quote the example as well, right? That is given to you by the legislature to help you out with understanding, but not for you to quote it anywhere wherever you are using the section. So we understand that they do not form part of the section, but there's one more thing that you need to understand, that they do form part of the entire statute, right? So illustrations are integral part of the statute but are not a part of the section. Clear? And understand one thing very clearly, that the purpose of illustration is to support the section, to support the statute, right? To bring out the clear, evident meaning of the statute. So they do not go beyond what the statute wants to say, neither do they try to curtail what the statute is saying. That means they do not add anything, neither do they reduce something from it. They give you an illustration on exactly what the statute is about, what the section is about, right? So at any point of time when there is a conflict that arises between the illustration and the section, then you know what prevails, right? It's always the section. It's not the illustration. Clear with it? So that is the use of interpretation as an internal aid to your use of illustration as an internal aid to your interpretation, and that is how that will be applicable. Clear with it? If yes, then we move on to the next aid, which is proviso, right? And again, this needs a detailed explanation now, right? Have you ever heard of the term proviso? Any one of you? People who are attempting for their group 2 as well and who are preparing for their direct tax, right? They will have surely heard about the word proviso, right? Because as per your statute, you have the 6th, 7th chapter, that is the capital gain, right? Which is actually the first major chapter that you have. It has a weightage around 10 marks in the examination. So you must have definitely started with the capital gain. Generally students do, even I did that, right? Because you do not pay a lot of attention to salary, house property and other things, because it does not form an integral part of your final course. That was also present in your IPCC. And if you see, as per the weightage in the examination, they do not carry a lot of weight, but capital gain does. So whenever you start with capital gain, right, when you go ahead section by section, right, then you come across some provisos over there. Remember, proviso for your indexation, proviso for your TTBR, TTSR, telegraphic transfer buying rate, selling rate, proviso for your debentures and other things, the foreign currency items, how do you consider them long term? You have proviso, right? And at many places you also say that, yeah, for this we'll refer to proviso 1, we'll refer to proviso 2. right? Proviso forms an integral part even when you are going with your calculations, right? Proviso forms an integral part. So that is one place where you must have heard about the word proviso, and I'm sure most of you will have heard about the word proviso. But do you actually understand the meaning of proviso? Do you actually know what proviso means, what proviso stands for? So today you will understand the meaning of proviso, and then you will understand, and then if you go back and read your capital gain sections again, right, you will actually get the feel of reading that section after understanding the meaning of the word proviso. Because you will know its usefulness, you will know its application, and you will know how to interpret it, right? So let us start with proviso. So first thing on the screen, what we have for proviso is that it is used to create an exception to what has already been stated in the main body, right? I'll link it to your capital gain provisos, right? I'll take that as the complete example for this topic, and I'll explain and demonstrate everything related to capital gain. Clear? That will be fine with you, right? Because taking any other example will not serve the purpose, because people who are preparing for group 2, that will already be helpful for you, and those who are not, you will be preparing, right? Or maybe you have cleared your group 2, so you know it already, right? So that is one thing where you will be able to link with, right? So if you try and understand, then the section in the capital gain, it already includes everything, right? But the words used are very general. That yeah, this is how you calculate the capital gain. This is what capital gain means. This is where we see that yes, when you sell it, right, you are gaining out of it, and the difference between your purchase price or your carrying value and the sale price, right, will be your capital gain and will be taxed. That is given in the section, right? But now when you actually go and use that in your practical situation or in the questions, in the practical questions that you have, then you go on to find difficulties. When you see that the capital asset that was taken long ago, maybe 20-30 years back, right? When it had a different written down value, it had a different book value, it had a rate of depreciation that is accompanying it. Today you are selling it at some other rate, right? And then you see that okay, that time 30 years back when I took it, it was like nominal value, it was at the nominal value. Maybe you took it for 10,000, 1 lakh, and today you're selling it for 2 crores. Yeah, you get cases like that, right? And you say, man, if I'm selling it for 2 crores and I took it for 2 lakh rupees, then am I liable to pay tax on 98 lakhs? That is injustice. Because you know, that time the value of money was very less, so even 2 lakh was a big amount. So you need to compare it, right? That is when you get into the concept of indexation. But the section does not talk anything about indexation. What talks about indexation is the proviso, right? The proviso deals with your indexation over there. So what do you conclude out of it? If I talk to you in the law term, if I talk to you in the terms of the interpretation of statute, then what do you conclude with that situation? That the proviso is provided to specify or to bring out, right, to give an importance to something which is already stated in the main body of the section, right? They already mean it, right? And which would have been true even if the proviso was not there. But to bring your attention to it and to qualify or to create an exception out of it, you have been provided with a proviso. Because otherwise your brain would not have gone to that portion. Why? Because it is not specifically mentioned in the section. Although the section means to say, yeah, okay, you'll take it. That is a general concept, right? You'll take it. You will consider the value as per the inflation, right? You will bring it to one parallel rate, the present value of the money concept. But how do you do it, right? Then the proviso comes into play and gives you a specific definition or a specific use of that indexation, and it gives you a procedure. It defines that okay, when the statute was being prepared by the legislatures, they intended this. So if you're not able to interpret it, please take my help and get to a correct conclusion of how do you apply what. right? So I hope now you are understanding what provisos are actually applicable for, right? And I hope that it is making your task clear with it. Understand? So are you comfortable with the word proviso now? Now when you go back to your capital gain in your direct tax, right, will you consider your section and your proviso? You'll read them twice and then you'll understand that okay, this has been included specifically for this, right? Again, when you are talking about your foreign exchange, right, you had taken an asset in some other country, selling it in some other country, and then you have a capital gain difference that was in dollar, this is in rupee. How do you convert? What date rate you take? So to clarify that doubt again, the proviso is included, right? That you are supposed to take the telegraphic transfer, buying rate, selling rate, the average, the latest rate, what rate has to be taken when. All these things are included in the proviso, right? Now there is one more thing that you need to understand, right? That needs your attention. Now when we are talking about a proviso, like if we are talking about the capital gain also, then you know that the proviso is a part of a specific section, right? So it is talking about whatever is given in that specific section, in that specific provision, right? So that means whatever is given in that proviso always relates to any specific provision. It does not relate to all the provisions in general. So you will not consider a proviso to be giving you a general rule that okay, whenever you have this problem, use this. No. It gives you a task which is provided or which is connected to a particular provision. That means the scope of the proviso is limited to the subject matter which is being covered or which is under consideration by the main section, right? Now we also need to understand what is the objective of the legislature for inserting a proviso. Why did they insert a proviso and why did not they go ahead with explaining everything in the provision itself? Because that would make the provision cumbersome. The provision would be burdened with a lot of words, a lot of definitions, a lot of statements, right, which would make it a very cumbersome task. So to keep it simple, to keep it plain, right, they try to use the provision limited with that limited words that you can use whenever you are referring to the provision, and if there is some exception that needs to be brought out, right, for that they use the proviso. So if we talk about the objectives, basically the objectives can be divided into 5 parts. Number 1, contains an exception. So when we say that the proviso contains an exception, means that okay, you have a section in your hand, right? You have gone through the section, you have interpreted it very well, but there are certain exceptions that the provision actually intends to demonstrate, but the words of the section are not capable of doing so, right? So that exception that the statute or the legislature actually intended to add to that statute or to that specific provision will be included in the proviso. That okay, this is something we wanted or we intended to include in the provision, but since the language or the drafting of the statute or the provision was not up to the level to bring out the evidence or to bring out this exception very beautifully, right, since it was not so useful, or it was not presented in such a way that it could be brought out to its exact meaning, hence we are including a proviso that will bring your attention to that specific exemption, or that specific exception which is a part of the proviso, which is a part of the provision, right, but is specified separately in a proviso. Why? Because that was important, and it was also important for the statute or the legislature to draw your attention to that specific portion of the provision, right? I know I went on to talk a lot of things over there in a single statement, but did you understand that if there is something exception which is not clear by the provision, it is given in the proviso? That is it, right? Next you have, it indicates the true meaning. When will it indicate the true meaning? When the true meaning is not there with you. And when will you not have the true meaning? When the actual provision is not capable of bringing out the true intention of the legislature or the true meaning of the provision, right? So to clarify that doubt and to bring out the real intent of the legislature, the proviso is included to it, right? right? So it is basically used to indicate the true intention, the true meaning. Now third is, it insists on certain condition. That means in general when you're reading the provision, right, it would give you, or it will take you to some other direction, but that is the reason, because the legislature does not want you to be going into that direction, right? Because once they have enacted the statute, right, and then they found out that okay, if you take a plain reading of the statute, or if you try to interpret it, then you are going to some other direction, or it becomes very vague, right? So if they want that, yes, they should insist upon any certain condition, any specific condition, then to promote that or to help them with that, what they do is they include a proviso, right? Because you understand, again, in capital gain, that your section says, okay, what you have to do is you have to reduce the purchase price, right, from your sale price, and the difference will be charged to capital gain. So that is a different direction that it is taking you, right? Because it is not talking about the concept of equalization of the value of money, bringing it to the present value, right? That is why the proviso is inserted, right? Because it insists on certain condition, and the condition is the indexation. The condition is that you have to analyze the time value of money, right? Now next, if we talk about proviso making a substantive provision, what does that mean? That means that when the legislature, right, they drafted the statute, they included a provision in it, right, then they have taken it to one level. They have included certain scope, objective and purpose to that provision, right? But now if they after that try to expand the scope, right, they try to take the provision to a different level, or they try to include more things, they try to encompass something else in the same provision, what they do is they can extend the area or the scope of the provision by including a proviso, right? The proviso that is included, that extends the meaning of the provision, actually makes it a substantive provision. So you understand that if the proviso even fulfills the purpose of expanding the provision, or taking a provision to a next level, or to taking the proviso to a different level, or to provide for a substantive provision, right? And finally, it is also used to give an explanation, right? That means it is used to bring out the real meaning of the provision, right? It is inserted into your statute, right, along with your provision, with the sole objective of explaining the real intendment of the statutory provision, right? That means it is actually used to give an explanation, to provide an explanation in a simpler language of the provision that is included in the statute, right? And why is it actually done? Because the language that is used in the provision may at some point of time be a little difficult for you to interpret. And if they think that okay, they are not solving the purpose, that means the people are not able, or the users are not able to interpret it in the most accurate way, so they add a provision for the explanation. Okay, this is what we actually intended to mean out of it, right? They could also do it with an illustration, but taking an illustration is taking an example, that if this is the case, then you apply it in this way, right? But if they do not intend to give an example with a particular situation, but they want to generalize a concept and explain it in detail, they use proviso, right? Because using illustration may not serve the purpose, because illustrations are generally used when there are some specific things to deal with, or some specific situations to deal with. You can take an example of that situation, right? But if there is something very general on a large scale, then you use proviso for that. You cannot also use a definitional section over there. Why? Because your words of the provision already is a little complicated, that is not very easily interpreted. And if you use a definitional section over there, that also becomes a little difficult to interpret. So the best part to do over there is to include a proviso, right? So if we understand in totality what is the object of a proviso, the number one, it contains an exception. If there is some exception that needs to be brought out from the provision which is not generally seen, or that will be overlooked when you go through the text of the provision, then to bring out that exception, a proviso is used. Second, it indicates the true meaning. That means the true intention of the legislature is brought out by using a proviso. Third, it insists on certain conditions. That means if there are certain conditions that the provision wants to provide, but when you look at the provision, you go to a general concept, then to bring your attention to that certain condition, a proviso is included. Right? And if you also at times want to expand the scope or the purpose of a provision, then for that purpose you can include a proviso and take it to be a substantive provision. And in that situation, right, I forgot to tell you, but in that situation the proviso becomes an integral part of the provision and the statute. So you will refer to the proviso whenever you are referring to the provision. Right? When does it happen? When the proviso actually goes on to make the provision a substantive provision. And the last one was only about giving an explanation. When the words are not very clear, when the words are ambiguous, or when the interpretation becomes difficult, the proviso is used to give the exact explanation, the intention of the legislature. So that is the use of proviso. Right? Now I hope you are clear with the definitional section, the illustration and the proviso. Right? We still have some other internal aids to interpretation like the explanation, the schedules, or the schedules actually. I'll talk about the two different, right? The schedule and the schedule in the next class. I'll tell you as per what language, what word you use. You have to be strong in your vocabulary as well, right? That is beyond your course. Then you have to read the statute on the whole, and finally one small thing, that is the punctuation. So we'll deal with all those things in the coming lecture. So until then, allow me to take off, right? So I'll see you guys in the next lecture. Until then, this is Abhinay Gupta signing off. Thank you and bye-bye.